The Panama Canal.
Table of Contents. The Panama Canal Part 3 Review Transit Power and Summary.
A summary view of the Panama Canal, with a time-lapse tour and a look at the power needed to operate the canal.
Dr. Sydney Soclof. Dr. Sydney 22 at gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sydney Soclof.
Zoe Phonemes.
And Nathan Koltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. The story of the Panama Canal.
The story of the Panama Canal, 1513 to now. 500 years of history, during most of which nothing much happened.
The Panama Canal is a lock-type canal, now owned and administered by the Republic of Panama.
The overall cost of the canal was about $350 million when completed in 1914. $12 billion in today's money. The largest and costliest work ever undertaken by the U.S. government. It was one of the world's premier feats of engineering.
The concrete lock chambers and mechanical lock gates were the largest ever built. At the time, Gatun Dam was the largest earthen dam ever built, forming the world's largest artificial lake.
Since opening, the canal has been enormously successful, and continues to be a key conduit for international shipping. Over 1 million ships have passed through the canal.
The Panama Canal has had an enormous impact on shipping between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, eliminating the long and treacherous route via the Drake Passage and Cape Horn, at the southernmost tip of South America.
Panama Canal Timeline 1515 El Camino Real, 1848 The California Gold Rush, 1850 to 1855 The Panama Railway built, 1880 The French work begins, and in 1888 the French effort ends. 1903 Independence of Panama from Colombia. 1904 the Americans begin digging, and in 1914 the canal was completed. In 1999, the canal was transferred to Panama. And finally the expansion project was started in 2007 and completed in 2016. The Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the narrow Isthmus of Panama.
Ships sailing between the east and west coasts of the United States and Canada, which otherwise would have to go around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, shortened their voyage by about 9,000 miles by using the canal. A ship sailing from New York to San Francisco via the canal travels 6,000 miles. Well under half the distance of the previous 14,000-mile route around Cape Horn.
There is a similar saving in eliminating the transit around the southern tip of South America to go between European ports and the west coast of the US and Canada, and also for other transoceanic routes.
Ships sailing between Europe and East Asia or Australia can save as much as 2,000 miles by using the canal.
Savings of up to 4,000 miles are also made on voyages between one coast of North America and ports on the other side of South America.
A major impediment to travel around the southern tip of South America is the storm-tossed waters of the Drake Passage.
Perhaps the most turbulent wind-driven waters on Earth are the 600 miles between the southern tip of South America at Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula.
This is the Drake Passage, named after Sir Francis Drake, who was one of the first to navigate these waters.
Here is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is the world's largest ocean current. It circulates in a clockwise or westerly direction at an average speed of about 1/2 of a mile per hour.
Here is the average wind speed over a period of 10 years. Looking at the region between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, We note the great intensity of the wind speed.
Whereas over much of Europe and North America we have wind speeds in the 9 to 13 miles per hour range. Down in this region the wind speed averages 16 to 20 miles per hour. Here is a more detailed view of the Drake Passage between Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America and Antarctica.
It is this high wind speed and the ocean currents that make navigation around Cape Horn so very difficult. So, not only is the distance longer, but the voyage is much more hazardous and difficult.
There is a great Cordillera, or chain of mountains, throughout the length of North and South America, extending from above the Arctic Circle in northern Alaska to Terra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America.
This Cordillera begins with the Brooks Range in northern Alaska, then continues through the Canadian Rockies, the Rocky Mountains in the U.S., the Sierra Madre in Mexico, the mountains of Central America, and then the Andes of South America, all of the way down to Tierra del Fuego, at the southern tip of South America.
This shows Central America, with the narrow Isthmus of Panama, which is only 50 miles wide. To the south of Panama is the South American country of Colombia, and to the north is Costa Rica and Nicaragua.
We see that not only is the Isthmus of Panama the narrowest land between the oceans in all of the Americas,
but it is also the region of lowest elevation. These two factors are what drew early attention to this as a possible location for a transoceanic canal. The elevations in this region of the Isthmus of Panama are much lower than further to the east and north, where elevations up to 10,000 feet are encountered,
and to the east and south, with elevations in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 feet.
In the lowest and narrowest part of the isthmus, elevations are down to below 500 feet. Nevertheless, these elevations still posed a major challenge for building a canal.
The Panama Canal cuts through the continental divide of the Americas. The isthmus is only about 50 miles wide here, but the elevation rises to 312 feet.
The French tried to cut straight through, like they successfully did in the flat terrain of Suez, but failed. The Americans then took up the task, using a system of locks, and succeeded.
Note that the Panama Canal is mostly oriented north-south, and the entrance at the Atlantic Ocean is slightly to the west of the entrance on the Pacific Ocean side. Therefore, a ship sailing from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the canal actually travels from northwest to southeast. The length of the Panama Canal from shoreline to shoreline is about 40 miles. And from deep water in the Atlantic, more specifically, the Caribbean Sea, to deep water in the Pacific is about 51 miles.
The Panama Canal is one of the two most strategic artificial waterways in the world, the other being the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, and thence to the Indian Ocean.
The Suez Canal shortens the route from Europe to Asia by eliminating the need to go around the southern tip of Africa. The Panama Canal was constructed in two stages. The first, between 1881 and 1888, was the work carried out by the French company headed by Ferdinand de Lesseps. The second stage was the work by the Americans, which eventually completed the canal's construction between 1904 and 1914.
Panama Canal Timeline, 1515-Gold and El Camino Real.
The strategic location of the Isthmus of Panama, and the short distance between the oceans there, have prompted many attempts over the centuries to forge a trading route between the oceans.
Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa was the first European to cross the dense, rainforested, and hilly terrain of the Isthmus of Panama and see the Pacific Ocean. Long before the canal, the Isthmus of Panama was an important route for the transshipment of gold and silver from the mines of Bolivia, Peru and Ecuador.
Spain was primarily interested in riches, gold and silver from its colonies in the New World.
The Spanish conquest of South America started in the north, and then went south along the west coast. The main interest in this region was finding riches, gold and silver in particular. The gold and silver riches of the Inca Empire drew the Spanish conquistadors down to Peru. Lima became the most important Spanish colonial city in the area. Then the discovery of the fabulously rich silver deposits of the Cerro Rico, or Rich Hill, at Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, added to this interest.
The main trade route was north, up the coast to Panama, and then across to the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean to Spain. King Philip III ordered that the trade route in South America should go up the west coast through Lima to Panama, and thence across to Isthmus to the Caribbean, and on to Spain.
Trade from Lima and across Panama to Cadiz in Spain took close to 6 months.
A complete round-trip exchange between Lima and Spain could take an entire year.
Construction of a canal was far beyond the engineering technology of Balboa's time. But roads quickly sprang up to support portage between cargo ships.
A trail crossing the isthmus that had been used by the natives for centuries was discovered in 1515. It was improved and paved by the Spaniards, and became El Camino Real.
Although all of the early schemes involved a land route linking ports on either coast, speculation on a possible canal goes back to the earliest days of European exploration of Panama. Spain once pondered building a Panama Canal. Should the canal be built or not? It must have seemed logical to see what the Bible had to say about such a project. After consulting with his religious advisors, who reminded him of the scriptural warning, "What God has joined together let no man put asunder,"
King Philip II declared that to seek or make known any better route than the one from Portobello to Panama is forbidden under penalty of death.
Panama Canal Timeline, 1848. The California Gold Rush. El Camino Real lasted many years, and was even used in the 1840s by gold prospectors heading for the California Gold Rush.
The route saw its greatest overland use following the gold rushes that began in California in 1848. The wagon train trip from the east to the west coast of the United States was fraught with danger and took 6 months. Traveling by ship around South America's Cape Horn was nearly as dangerous, and took 2 to 4 months.
By taking a ship to Panama, crossing at the Isthmus, and again setting out by ship on the Pacific, the empty trip took little more than a month.
This advertises a time of only 35 days.
Panama Canal Timeline 1850 to 1855. Panama Railway was built. By the 19th century it was becoming clear that a cheaper and faster alternative was required. Given the difficulty of constructing a canal with the available technology, a railway seemed the ideal solution. By the middle of the century, several factors turned in favor of a link: the acquisition of the southwestern U.S. at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848,
and the increasing movement of settlers to the west coast created a demand for a fast route between the oceans,
which was fueled even further by the discovery of gold in California.
The Panama Railway was built across the isthmus from 1850 to 1855, running 47 miles from Colón, on the Atlantic coast, to Panama City on the Pacific. The Panama Railway crosses the wild Chagres River at several points. This is a canal zone postage stamp, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Panama Railroad in 1955.
The project was an engineering marvel of its age, carried out in brutally difficult conditions. It is estimated that more than 12,000 people died in its construction, many of them from cholera and malaria.
Until the opening of the Panama Canal, the railway carried the heaviest volume of freight per unit length of any railroad in the world. The existence of the railway was key in the selection of Panama as the site of the canal.
The construction of the Panama Railroad foreshadowed many of the difficulties faced by the builders of the canal. Between 1850 and 1855, it is estimated that about 40% of rail workers died from diseases such as yellow fever.
The rail line would carry thousands of passengers per year, until the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The Panama Canal Railroad still operates today, carrying mostly container freight.
This shows the original and present route of the Panama Railroad.
A number of surveys were carried out between 1850 and 1875 for a canal route. The conclusion was that the two most favorable routes were those across Panama, then a part of Colombia, and across Nicaragua, with a route across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico as a third option. The Nicaragua route was seriously considered and surveyed.
The proximity of the Tehuantepec Isthmus to the access of international trade gives it some advantage over the Panama route. However, the Isthmus of Panama is significantly narrower, making for a shorter traversal. The great cost of a canal across the isthmus compelled engineers and capitalists to give it up as impracticable. Nevertheless, James Beades proposed to construct a quadruple track-ship railway, and the scheme received serious attention for some time.
This shows the route of the ship-carrying railroad across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The French project.
The French project, a canal before its time.
After the successful completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, the French were inspired to tackle the apparently similar project to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and it were confident that this could be carried out with little difficulty. Ferdinand de Lessups, who was in charge of the construction of the Suez Canal, was the figurehead of the scheme. De Lessups' success at Suez made him confident, perhaps too confident, that the canal at Panama would be no different.
De Lessups, despite his previous success, was not an engineer. The construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 was essentially that of a ditch dug through a flat, sandy desert and presented few challenges.
Panama, however, was to be very different and much more difficult. De Lessups believed that if a sea-level canal worked when constructing the Suez Canal, it must work for the Panama Canal. The French efforts to build a canal were doomed to costly failure for two principal reasons. Surveyors and most engineers recognized the difficulty of the terrain, including its rocky elevation changes, and recommended the construction of a canal with tunnels and locks. However, French leadership insisted on the simplicity of a sea-level design. As with the successful French-made Suez Canal, the mountainous spine of Central America comes to a low point at Panama, but still rises to a height of 360 feet above sea level at the lowest crossing point.
A sea-level canal, as proposed by de Lesseps, would require a prodigious excavation through the varied hardness of the rock rather than the easy sand of Suez. The sea-level plan required significantly more digging, and also introduced the danger of flooding from the Chagres River. which in the tropical climate of Panama can receive up to 200 inches of rainfall per year. This meant it would take longer to complete the canal and further expose workers to disease. The second major cause of the French failure. A less obvious barrier was presented by the rivers crossing the canal, particularly the Chagres River, which flows very strongly in the rainy season.
This water could not simply be dumped into the canal, as it would present an extreme hazard to shipping. So, a sea-level canal would recue the river, which cuts right across the canal route, to be diverted. The most serious problem of all, however, was tropical diseases, particularly malaria and yellow fever.
Since it was unknown at the time how these diseases were contracted, any precautions against them were doomed to failure.
De Lesseps was convinced that a sea-level canal, dug through the mountainous, rocky spine of Central America, could be completed as easily as, or even more easily than, the Suez Canal.
De Lesseps was unfamiliar with conditions in Panama, and was unwilling to acknowledge that they were vastly different from Suez.
So, it was an idée fixe. Ferdinand de Lesseps thought that what worked at Suez must work at Panama. Suez is a flat sandy region where two continents meet, whereas Panama is a continental divide, although a very narrow and relatively low one. He insisted on a sea-level canal.
This proposal for a sea-level canal was protested strongly by Adolphe Gaudin de l'Épinay, Baron de Bruceley, an engineer who had studied the isthmus in detail.
In 1879, l'Épinay proposed a practical plan for building a canal. This was to build dams to create a huge lake, and use locks to raise and lower the ships,
so that they can float across the continental divide. L'Épinay's conception eventually established him as an architectural and engineering genius, and as the originator of the plan from which the Panama Canal was eventually built. Unfortunately for the French, however, his idea was ignored at the time, and the Compagnie Universelle embarked on its ill-fated undertaking.
Unlike the arid desert of the Isthmus of Suez, Panama was a tropical jungle, with tremendous rains, debilitating heat and humidity, and tropical diseases.
Topographic conditions along the proposed route varied considerably and ranged from coastal marshes to the mountains of the Continental Divide.
Despite competent engineering, there was no sound overall plan. Machinery used to dig the canal was either too light or ill-suited for the tough inland terrain, and disease took a terrible toll in workers' lives.
Panama Canal timeline 1880. The French work begins.
Construction of the canal began on January 1, 1880. A huge labor force was assembled. By 1888, this numbered about 20,000 men, 9/10 of these being Afro-Caribbean workers from the West Indies.
Although extravagant rewards were given to French engineers who joined the canal effort, the huge death toll from disease made it difficult to retain them. The French engineers either left after short service or died. The total death toll between 1881 and 1889 was estimated at over 22,000, after 5 years of digging. In 1885, it had become clear to many that a sea-level canal was impractical,
and that an elevated canal with locks was the best answer. However, de Lesseps was stubborn, and it was not until October 1887 that the lock canal plan was adopted. The French company started to face financial difficulties in 1885 and even applied to the French government to issue lottery bonds.
Under the wet conditions, Dirt and mud would slide back into the newly dug canal track before it could be shored up. Problems mounted. And by 1887, the French engineers admitted that the sea-level canal could not be built, instead agreeing to a lock construction to meet the rocky elevation at the continental divide at Culebra.
1888 The French effort ended. It was a work before its time. A sea-level canal instead of a lock type. Tropical diseases. And inadequate equipment. It was a canal before its time. The state-of-the-art of engineering, science, and technology in the 1880s was simply not up to the task. The story of the Panama Canal, the Americans, the United States and the canal.
The discovery of gold in California in 1848 and the rush of would-be miners stimulated the U.S. interest in creating a canal between the oceans.
Recognizing a need for a water passage, in part for U.S. naval ships, President Ulysses S. Grant ordered surveys of Panama and Nicaragua in 1869. The results favored a canal route through Nicaragua. Theodore Roosevelt, who became President of the United States in 1901, believed that the U.S.-controlled canal across Central America was of vital strategic interest to the U.S. This idea gained wide impetus following the destruction of the battleship USS Maine in Cuba in 1898, and the Spanish-American War that followed.
The USS Oregon, a battleship stationed in San Francisco, was dispatched to take the place of the battleship USS Maine, but the voyage around Cape Horn took 67 days. Although she was in time to join in the Battle of Santiago Bay, the voyage would have taken just 3 weeks via Panama.
Theodore Roosevelt was the big stick president. Might was good, though not necessarily right. Roosevelt was especially proud of America's Navy and its naval power. The incident during the Spanish War involving the battleship Oregon's 2-month trip around South America also affected Roosevelt and the rest of America in a big way.
Ships sailing between the east and west coasts of the United States and Canada, which otherwise would have to go around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, would shorten their voyage by about 8,000 miles by using the canal.
President Roosevelt saw a canal as a prerequisite to American naval superiority, and wanted to purchase the rights to the French side for $40 million. This would give the U.S. a substantial head start on its own construction, provide the shortest possible route, and include the railroad. Seeing that the company would lose to Nicaragua, the Compagnie Nouvelle decided to sell for just $40 million. Which would put the Panama project at a cost about equal to Nicaragua. Now, the biggest battle over the canal was to begin.
Congress was split between the two canal routes, Panama and Nicaragua. Roosevelt pushed through the acquisition of the French Panama Canal effort. Panama was then part of Colombia, so Roosevelt opened negotiations with the Colombians to obtain the necessary permission. In early 1903 the Hay-Herran Treaty was signed by both nations, but the Colombian Senate failed to ratify the treaty. In 1903, Panama became independent of Colombia. This is a map of present-day Colombia.
U.S. treaty negotiations with Colombia stalled. So Roosevelt sidestepped Colombia by aiding Panama's independence movement.
In a controversial move, Roosevelt implied to Panamanian rebels that if they revolted, the U.S. Navy would assist their cause for independence. Roosevelt launched a naval blockade on both sides of Panama, and sent in U.S. troops to fend off the minimal Colombian forces.
Panama proceeded to proclaim its independence from Colombia in 1903. And the USS Nashville in local waters impeded any interference from Colombia. The U.S. gunboat Nashville prevented the Colombian military from sailing to Panama. An assault through the dense Panamanian jungle was impossible. Panama Canal timeline 1904 Americans begin digging. The United States formally took control of the French property relating to the canal on May 4, 1904.
Even at this date, no decision had been taken regarding whether the canal should be a lock canal or a sea-level canal. The excavation that was underway would be useful in either case.
In 1906, Roosevelt resolved in favor of a lock-type canal. The plan was similar in all essential respects to the one proposed by Lepine years earlier, but rejected by de Lessups.
Included in the proposal was an enormous earthen dam across the Chagres River at Gatun. The dam created what was then the largest artificial lake in the world, Gatun Lake, and at the same time it brought a considerable part of the Chagres River under control.
So massive was the lake that it was able to accommodate the greater part of the river, even at flood stage.
Perhaps more important, the man-made lake formed more than 20 miles of the canal route. Roosevelt decided that Army engineers should carry out the work, and appointed Major General George Washington Goethals as chief engineer in 1907. One of the greatest challenges facing the builders of the Panama Canal was dealing with the tropical diseases in the area, particularly yellow fever and malaria.
Before any work could begin, the deadliest of the problems on the isthmus had to be overcome: disease. The government wasn't going to allow mortality rates like had been seen during the French reign. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 were estimated to have died at the canal zone between 1882 and 1888. The eventual success of the project is owed substantially to the sanitation program put in place by Dr. Gorgas, which included general health care and the provision of an extensive health infrastructure.
Gorgas was not the discoverer of the ability of mosquitoes to transmit certain diseases. That credit is reserved for Dr. Walter Reed and Sir Ronald Ross. Dr. Reed brought what he had learned in Havana to Panama. By the time the new dig began, Major Walter Reed, a U.S. doctor conducting research in Cuba, had proven that mosquitoes carried yellow fever.
And Sir Ronald Ross, a British bacteriologist who won the Nobel Prize in 1902 for his work showing that malaria was transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito.
The theory, and proven fact, was that malaria and yellow fever were transmitted from infected to healthy individuals by female mosquitoes of the Anopheles and Stegomyia breeds, which are only commonly found along the equator.
The goal of Gorgas was to eliminate the mosquito population from the canal zone. This was not easy as the French had built a veritable mosquito hotel along the canal site, including sewage drains and bowls of water used to protect people.
The efforts were a great success, and contributed significantly to the overall success of the canal project. The hospitals were reputed to be the best anywhere in the tropics. Some 32,000 patients were treated every year. By 1906, yellow fever was virtually wiped out in the canal zone, and the number of deaths caused by the other top disease, malaria, was also reduced significantly.
The advances in hygiene resulted in a relatively low death toll during the American construction. Still, 5,609 workers died during this period of 1904 to 1914. This brought the total death toll for the construction of the canal to 27,609.
One of the greatest barriers to a canal was the Continental Divide, which originally rose to 360 feet above sea level at its highest point.
The most difficult area of excavation was the area at Culebra Mountain, the Culebra Cut. The canal had to be dug out of the largest mountain in the path, which actually was one of the smallest mountains on the isthmus.
The French had floundered at Culebra because they had attempted to maintain a certain slope at the sides, an angle that became impossible to hold.
The heavy Panamanian rainfall caused mudslides year-round until a very gradual slope was attained by the massive steam shovels, working almost 24 hours a day.
This is a cross-section of the Gaillard Cut. This is a 95-ton Bucyrus steam shovel in the Gaillard Cut. In 1911, excavations were conducted simultaneously on several levels, requiring a sophisticated railroad network.
Railroads and heavy machinery were critical elements. Most notable was the use of more than 100 steam shovels, many of which were used to dig the Gaillard Cut.
The Gaillard Cut was later called Gaillard Cut, after David Dubois Gaillard, the American engineer who supervised its construction until his death in 1913.
Workers who labored in temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or higher used rock drills, dynamite, and steam shovels to remove as much as 96 million cubic yards of earth and rock, as they lowered the floor of the excavation to within 40 feet of sea level.
On May 20, 1913, steam shovels made a passage through the Gaillard Cut, at the level of the canal bottom. The French effort had reduced the summit to 193 feet, but of a relatively narrow width. The Americans had lowered this to 40 feet above sea level, of a much greater width.
Here is a profile, or cross-sectional view, of the Panama Canal.
This cross-section shows the route of a ship through the Panama Canal.
It's 3 steps up from sea level at the Pacific side, to the level of Gatun Lake, and then 3 steps down to sea level, on the Atlantic side.
The height of ships must be raised and lowered in the locks and going between sea level at the Atlantic Ocean to the level of Gatun Lake. And from Gatun Lake down to the Pacific Ocean is 85 feet.
Ships entering from the Atlantic Ocean are raised 85 feet to the level of Gatun Lake by a series of 3 locks. At the end of Gatun Lake the Gaillard Cut begins. Each of the 3 locks raises the ships by about 28 feet.
Almost 2/3 of the canal route, 32 miles out of the total of 51 miles, is actually across Gatun Lake,
formed by the damming of the Wild Shark Race River by the Gatun Dam. After Gatun Lake there is the Gaillard Cut, the narrowest section of the canal. The channel through the Gaillard Cut is 8 miles long and 490 feet wide. At the end of the Gaillard Cut are the locks at Pedro Miguel, which lowers ships to the Miraflores Lake. The single-stage locks at Pedro Miguel lowers ships 31 feet to Miraflores Lake. At the end of Miraflores Lake are the 2-stage Miraflores locks, which lower ships 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific terminus in the Bay of Panama. Here is an overview view of the profile of the canal. The continental divide is at an elevation of 312 feet.
This shows in more detail the Atlantic end of the canal, with the 3-stage Gatun locks that raise ships a total of 85 feet to the level of Gatun Lake. The ships then traverse Gatun Lake for a distance of 32 miles to the exit at Gamboa. Then there is the passage through the Gaillard Cut, formerly known as the Gaillard Cut. This cut traverses the continental divide and is the highest terrain along the entire route of the canal.
After the Culebra cut out the Pedro Miguel locks to lower ships 31 feet to the level of Miraflores Lake.
Finally, the two-stage Miraflores locks lower ships a final 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific Ocean end of the canal, near Panama City.
This shows the entire extent of the canal from Atlantic to Pacific. A typical passage through the canal by a cargo ship takes around 9 hours. 14,000 vessels pass through the canal every year, making an average of almost 40 per day, with a total capacity of 280 million tons.
This cross-section again shows the route of a ship through the Panama Canal. From the Atlantic Ocean, a ship is raised 85 feet through 3 sets of locks to the level of Gatun Lake. The ship then travels through the lake and Gaillard Cut, the narrowest section of the canal. It is then lowered through a lock to Miraflores Lake, and passes through 2 more locks, before reaching the Pacific Ocean.
A trip along the canal from its Atlantic entrance would take you through a 7-mile dredged channel in Limon Bay. The canal then proceeds for a distance of 11.5 miles to the Gatun Locks. This series of 3 locks raise ships 85 feet to Gatun Lake.
The Panama Canal continues south through a channel in Gatun Lake for 32 miles to Gamboa, where the Culebra Cut begins. At the end of this cut are the locks at Pedro Miguel. The Pedro Miguel locks lower ships 31 feet to Miraflores Lake, which then takes you to the Miraflores locks, which lower ships 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific terminus of the canal in the Bay of Panama.
Altogether, the Panama Canal consists of 17 artificial lakes, several improved and artificial channels, and 3 sets of locks. An additional artificial lake, Alajuela Lake, acts as a reservoir for the canal.
So here, in summary, is the 8 to 10 hour voyage from Atlantic to Pacific. It's up 85 feet or 26 meters through the Gatun Locks, over the Isthmus of Panama through Gatun Lake and the Culebra Cut, and then down 85 feet through the Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks to the Pacific Ocean.
A trip along the canal from its Pacific entrance near Panama City would take you to the 2-stage locks which raise ships 52 feet from sea level to Miraflores Lake. Then, after a short trip across Miraflores Lake, the Pedro Miguel locks raise ships 31 feet to the level of the Gaillard Cut in Gatun Lake. Then after an 8-mile trip through the Gaillard Cut, the ship reaches the wide expanse of Gatun Lake. Then after a 32-mile trip across Gatun Lake, the ships reach the Gatun Locks. The Gatun Locks are a series of 3 locks that lower ships 85 feet to sea level. The canal then proceeds for a distance of 11.5 miles to a 7-mile dredged channel in Limon Bay to the Atlantic Ocean.
Next, we will have a short video on how the Panama Canal works.
The Panama Canal is an engineering marvel that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, allowing ships to traverse between the 2 bodies of water without having to make the lengthy and dangerous trip around the southern tip of South America. The canal is located in the narrowest part of the Isthmus of Panama, a land bridge that separates the 2 oceans. Now let's discuss how the Panama Canal works. The Panama Canal has a lot of locking systems at every block. Yes, there are a lot of locking systems. They use these locks to raise and lower ships as they pass through the canal. There are 3 sets of locks: the Gatun locks on the Atlantic side, the Pedro Miguel lock in the middle part, and the Miraflores locks on the Pacific side. Now the primary water source for the canal is Gatun Lake, a man-made lake created by damming the Chagres River. The lake acts as a reservoir to supply water to the locks. When ships pass through the locks from the Atlantic side, they are raised to the level of Gatun Lake. Subsequently, they are lowered back to sea level as they pass through the locks on the Pacific side. Each set of locks consists of a series of chambers that are filled with water to raise the ships or emptied to lower them. The chambers have massive steel gates at each end that are opened and closed to control the flow of water. These gates keep the water from flowing freely between the chambers and the ocean. This gate is called the miter lock. The design is simple and is called a watertight lock. When the flowing water forces the gate to automatically close. After the gate closes, the water level is raised. To better understand how this gate works, I will make a video on how it works, so you better subscribe to this channel. Entering the locks. When a ship approaches the Panama Canal, it enters the first set of locks at the Atlantic or Pacific entrance, depending on its direction of travel. Each set of locks consists of 2 lanes, so multiple ships can pass through them simultaneously. Filling the locks, the water level in the lock chambers is adjusted to match the water level on either side of the lock. To raise the ship, the gates on the side facing the ocean are closed, and the gates on the side facing the lake are opened. Water is then allowed to flow into the chamber, gradually raising the ship to the level of the lake. Transitioning through locks. Once the water level in the lock chamber matches that of Gatun Lake, the ship can move forward to the next set of locks. This process is repeated in each set of locks until the ship reaches the highest point of Gatun Lake. And finally, the ship exits the last set of locks, and it is free to continue its journey in either the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. The Panama Canal is an intricate and efficient system that allows ships to safely navigate between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, saving time, fuel, and the risk of encountering hazardous weather conditions around Cape Horn.
The transit through the canal normally takes from 8 to 10 hours. But we will now experience a speeded-up time-lapse transit through the canal in just 7 minutes. So, a transit time of 7 hours become just 7 minutes. Hours become minutes. And minutes become seconds. Going through a lock in 10 minutes becomes just 10 seconds.
So here we are, at the end of our Panama Canal journey, and the Atlantic Ocean.
A final question. Where does the energy come from to lift the enormous weight of ships to go up 85 feet, 26 meters, and of the Panama?
The Zephyr is now the largest cargo capacity to transit the waterway. But Evergreen's Triton, measuring 369 meters in length, 51.2 meters in its beam, and 15.8 meters in draft, is the largest vessel by dimension. The gross tonnage of the Triton is 220,000. This corresponds to a weight of 220,000 metric tons times 2,205 pounds per ton equals 485 million pounds, or almost 500 million pounds. With a lift of 85 feet or 26 meters. The work or energy required for this size ship to go up and over the canal is 485 million pounds times 85 feet equals 41 million foot-pounds, and that equal 55.6 billion joules. or watt-seconds.
If the ship is raised in a two-stage lock in 5 minutes per stage. This is a total of 10 minutes or 600 seconds. So the POE required for each of the two stages of lift is 55.6 billion joules, or watt-seconds, divided by 600 seconds equals 93 million watts, or 93,000 kilowatts. Close to 100,000 kilowatts.
A power of 93,000 kilowatts is equal to 124,715 horsepower. The average mid-size car can generate 170 horsepower. Is for example a Toyota Corolla at 140 horsepower. So it would take the equivalent of 734 Toyotas, all pulling together to lift the Tridon up the 85 feet to go over Panama.
The average home uses 1.2 kilowatts at a time, with a peak demand of about 20 kilowatts. So, a POE of 100,000 kilowatts is enough to supply the peak POE demand of 5,000 homes, or the average demand of 80,000 homes.
Where does the Panama Canal get all of this power? We don't see the Panamanian jungle dotted with huge power plants.
The answer is solar energy and the hydrologic cycle. The sun heats the ocean waters. The water evaporates and rises up to form clouds. The clouds release their water to fall down on Panama.
The waters run through rivers, principally the Chagres River, to collect in Gatun Lake, 85 feet above sea level. Much of it is used to supply water to the locks to raise the ships from sea level up to the level of Gatun Lake.
And some of the water is used to turn turbines to generate electricity.
In fact, Gatun and the Lakes supply all of the water needed to operate the locks of the canal, and Gatun Dam supplies all of the electricity needed for the operation of the canal.
The Panama Canal, for all of its magnificence, is not the oldest, longest, or most heavily traveled canal. Those honors go to
the oldest canal. The Grand Canal of China began in 486 BC, is not only the world's oldest canal, but is far longer than either Suez or Panama. At 1,795 kilometers, or 1,114 miles, it has 24 locks and 60 bridges, and claims to the title of oldest and also longest canal.
The Beijing-Hangzhou Grand Canal connects China's Yellow River and Yangtze River. The canal passes through many provinces in the country and connects with many rivers. Connecting northern and southern China, the canal plays a major role in cargo transportation. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Grand Canal of China also reached the highest elevation in the world in the mountains of Shandong at a summit of 138 feet, 42 meters. Ships in Chinese canals did not have trouble reaching these higher elevations after the water level adjusting pound lock was invented in the 10th century.
The most heavily traveled canal is the Kiel Canal with an annual average of 32,000 ships, 90 daily, transporting approximately 100 million tons of goods.
After the Kiel Canal, in second place is the Suez Canal with around 22,000 transits annually. So, the Panama Canal with barely 14,000 is at best in third place.
The deepest canal in the world is the Corinth Canal, which connects the Gulf of Corinth in the Ionian Sea with the Saronic Gulf in the Aegean Sea. Opened in 1893, it is only 4 miles or 6.3 kilometers long, but has an extreme depth of 259 feet, or 79 meters.
The Corinth Canal is a sea-level canal with no locks. It cuts through the narrow Isthmus of Corinth and separates the Peloponnese from the Greek mainland. making the Peloponnese Peninsula an island.
The Corinth Canal is only 81 feet or 24.6 meters wide, cut through limestone, making it impassable for many modern ships, and is mainly now a tourist attraction.
Again, honors go to the Suez Canal. At its narrowest point, it is 656 feet, 200 meters, wide. Close behind in width is the Cape Cod Canal. Although only 7 miles, 11 kilometers, long, it is 480 feet, 150 meters, wide. It is a sea-level canal that was begun in 1909 and finally expanded to its present width in 1940.
This width of 480 feet or 150 meters is to be compared to the new Panama Canal locks at 180 feet or 55 meters wide. The Suez Canal at its narrowest point is 656 feet or 200 meters wide, and the Kiel Canal locks are 146 feet or 45 meters wide. In contrast, the Corinth Canal is only 81 feet or 24.6 meters in width. These are the longest canals in the world. We see that the Panama Canal at 65 kilometers doesn't even come close to making this list.
The most expensive canal in the world, in terms of tolls, is the Suez Canal, with the Panama Canal in second place. The tolls depend on the size of the ship, but can be as much as $675,000 for the largest ships in the Suez Canal, and $300,000 for Panama.
ATEU stands for a 20-foot equivalent unit. Most shipping containers that you see are 40 feet long and are equivalent to 2 TEUs. More often, you will see the 40-foot long containers commonly pulled by a semi-trailer truck. These are equivalent to 2 TEUs.
One post-Panamax ship can carry as many as 6,300 containers that are 40 foot long. This sounds extremely expensive. But when you consider the very large container ships like the Evergreen Tridon with a gross tonnage of 220,000, a toll of $300,000 corresponds to just 0.06 cents per pound. A toll of $675,000 is still only 0.14 cents per pound.
The Evergreen Tridon has a capacity of 14,424 TEU containers. The cost per TEU container for the Panama Transit is $21, and for Suez, it is $47. The shipping cost per TEU container is about 40 cents per mile. So the Panama Transit is equivalent to the cost of about 50 miles, and for Suez, it would be about 100 miles. Thus, going through these canals is still a net cost savings.
So, while the Panama Canal doesn't take top billing in age, number of ships, or length, because of the very difficult terrain and terrible climate, it was one of the most challenging of the canals to build.
Other canals. We all know that the Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. What canals connect these bodies of water? 1. Baltic Sea and North Sea. 2. Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. 3. Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. 4. North Sea and Black Sea. And 5. Lake Ontario and Lake Erie.
The Baltic Sea and North Sea are connected by the Kiel Canal, known officially as the Nordostsee Canal. It is only 61 miles, 98 kilometers, long, but it is the busiest canal in the world, with 32,000 ships annually.
The Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea are connected by the Suez Canal. At 120 miles, or 193 kilometers long, it is the second busiest canal in the world with 22,000 ship passages annually.
The Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean Sea are connected by the Canal des Dumas across the southern part of France. It is mainly now a barge canal, with no ocean-going ships.
The North Sea and the Black Sea are connected by the Main-Danube Canal between Bamberg and Nuremberg in Germany, together with the Rhine River coming from the North Sea, the Main River, and the Danube River ending at the Black Sea.
The Welland Canal connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie and bypasses the Niagara Falls. The Welland Canal is 27 miles or 43 kilometers long, and 3,000 ships transporting 40 million tons, 88 billion pounds, of cargo pass through annually.
A major part of the expansion project with the new Atlantic and Pacific approach channels and the much larger locks.
These were the three-stage Agua Clara locks on the Atlantic side and the three-stage Cocoli locks on the Pacific side.
The new locks tripled the container ship capacity and doubled the bulk weight capacity of the ships able to pass through.
The new locks use the rolling gates principle and use side basins to minimize water consumption. The gates are a dual system, with two independent gates servicing the entrance and exit of each lock. This improves the reliability and maintenance of the lock system since it is possible to maintain operations while one gate is serviced.
The cost of the Panama Canal was $383 million when completed in 1914. That's equivalent to $12 billion in today's money. In addition, both the Atlantic and Pacific accesses to the canal were dredged to accommodate larger vessel drafts. The Culebra or Gaillard Cut at the Continental Divide and the navigation channels between the Pacific locks and Gatun Lake were expanded to accommodate deeper drafts and vessels circulating in both directions.
The Gatun Lake navigation channel was deepened, and the water level of the lake was increased from 26.7 meters above sea level to 27.1 meters. This increased the water supply available to the lock systems.
Although the annual capacity only increased by about 2,000 additional ships able to transit the canal, individual ship capacity in terms of TEU almost tripled while bulk capacity in deadweight tons more than doubled. So the net amount of cargo though the canal has increased substantially.
These are the Panamax container ships, with capacities of up to 5,000 TEUs. These could transit the original locks of the Panama Canal.
These are the Neo-Panamax container ships that can pass through the expanded canal, with capacities of up to 14,000 TEUs. Post-Panamax ships of greater than 14,000 TEU must bypass the canal.
Can the largest warships of the U.S. Navy transit the Panama Canal?
The new lock chambers are 180 feet, 55 meters, wide, 1,400 feet, 427 meters, long, and 60 feet, 18.3 meters, deep. These dimensions allow for an estimated 79% of all cargo-carrying vessels to transit the canal, up from 45%.
The U.S. Navy Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers are among the largest ships in the world. Each ship is 78 meters, 256 feet, at its widest point, the flight deck, and 41 meters, 134 feet, wide at the waterline. They are 337 meters, 1,106 feet, long and draw 12 meters, 39 feet, of water fully loaded.
Although the Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carriers are 41 meters at the waterline, the flight deck is 78 meters wide. This would prevent it from going through the canal.
Hey, Doc, in your estimation, what canal, in its day, was of the greatest historical and engineering significance?
I would say that it was the Erie Canal completed in 1825.
On the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker, a good old pal.
Governor DeWitt Clinton and the state of New York were able to build a waterway 363 miles long, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie, near Buffalo.
This would establish an all-water transportation route from New York City, up the Hudson River to Albany, and then on the Erie Canal, from Albany to Lake Erie near Buffalo. The canal was the most ambitious engineering project undertaken anywhere in the country up to that time. A major and continuing problem of the Panama Canal has been landslides. This is due to the combination of the slippery soils of Panama and the tremendous rainfall.
Both the French and later the Americans tried to achieve an angle of repose, but it proved elusive. So more and more exhaustive digging and widening had to be done.
This is a cross-section of the Gaillard Cut showing how the amount of excavation increased over time.
How much does it cost to go through the Panama Canal?
For the Panamax locks, the tolls for large ships is about $4.70 per ton. For the Neo-Panamax locks of the expansion project, it's about $5 per ton.
The gross tonnage of the Trident is 220,000. At $5 per ton, this corresponds to a weight of 220,000 metric tons times $5 per ton equals $1.1 million.
A 40-foot container is 5 metric tons, and when fully loaded weighs up to 52 metric tons. At a toll of $5 per ton, the cost will range from $25 for an empty container up to $260 for a fully loaded container.
At a toll of $5 per ton, this corresponds to only 0.23 cents per pound, or 0.5 cents per kilogram. So that does not seem excessive. Recommended videos, Panama Canal. Part 3. Review transit power and summary.
Recommended video, How the Panama Canal Works.
Recommended video, Panama Canal, full transit, time-lapse.
Recommended video, Panama Canal, full transit time-lapse.
Recommended video, Official Panama Canal Expansion Time-Lapse 2011 to 2016.
Recommended video, Panama Canal Animation 2.
Recommended video, How the Panama Canal was built, BBC News.
Table of contents, the Panama Canal Part 3 Review Transit Power and Summary. Thanks for watching.